Marjorie Cohn is here to discuss a couple of articles featured on Truthout. The first is entitled, U.S. Slammed for Failure to Fulfill Legal Obligation to Eliminate All Forms of Race Discrimination. And the second piece is Obama Declares Perpetual War. Both of these articles are featured on her monthly column called Human Rights and Global Wrongs. She also has a new book coming out next month called Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues. Comes out next month, as I said. Welcome back, Marjorie, to Truthout Interviews.
My pleasure, Ted.
First off, your article about the United Nations report from their Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. There's quite an extensive list of the ways in which racial discrimination has increased under Obama's watch. But one thing perhaps that you can explain from a legal perspective, and I got this right from the outset of your article, was that a treaty with the UN that the U.S. has ratified. How is this part of the U.S. Constitution? Because constitutional questions, when you bring in the UN, especially in political debates, many people on the right and even maybe some on the left will say, well, the UN doesn't really have any authority over the U.S. The U.S. is a sovereign country. We don't answer to the United Nations. But now you're saying that legally there is something that is part of the U.S. Constitution when we sign treaties.
Yes, well, when the United States ratifies a treaty, it becomes part of U.S. law, part of our domestic U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which says treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. And that means that we're bound by the obligations that we have signed on to when we ratified that treaty.
Okay, so you have this Supremacy Clause, but oftentimes, and you probably have seen this in political debates and so forth, especially when the UN comes into play, that people just say, well, we don't defer to UN. We don't defer to the UN. We are a sovereign state, the United States. But rarely do I hear this Supremacy Clause argument.
Well, that's because the United States does such a poor job of publicizing our treaty obligations, which we are obligated to do when we ratify treaties. The UN is not imposing this treaty on us. We signed the treaty. We ratified the treaty. We became a party to the treaty on the elimination of racial discrimination. And interestingly, the reason that we ratified that treaty is because when George H.W. Bush was president and went to China and started criticizing China's human rights record, China said, well, then why hasn't the United States ratified these human rights treaties? And it kind of shamed us into ratifying the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
You go through the list of what the report says, and the amount of discrimination and outright hostility that is going on within the United States it's glaring. I mean, yes, if you're not shamed by this, if just by reading it and realizing, I guess the government really hasn't done anything to essentially reverse some of the most blatant forms of discrimination in the country. I mean, it is quite staggering.
It is staggering, and it hasn't just gotten worse under Obama. It's been bad all along. We have not made much progress, and Ferguson is, I think, a glaring example of that. But when you're talking about discrimination in voting rights, housing, education, healthcare, the criminal justice system, who gets the death penalty the most, kids who get life without parole, where they locate toxic waste dumps in minority communities, the list goes on and on and on. And racism, unfortunately, is still alive and well in the United States. And what the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the body that oversees the race convention, the treaty we ratified, said was, let's turn our attention to all of these problems that you have not remedied, and therefore you are in violation of your treaty obligations.
If a report like this comes out, and as you had put, it's rather scathing, just the list goes on and on. But we do live in a federalist government system. We have state, we have federal, we have even local laws that a state can craft. And one of the things that was talked about was the stand your ground laws. And we've talked about this on Truthout Interviews a couple of times about the stand your ground laws. This comes up in the report. However, I'm thinking about the Obama administration's ability to address something like stand your ground and essentially the state's right to craft that law.
Keep in mind, Ted, that when the United States ratifies a treaty like the Race Convention and becomes a party to that treaty, then the obligations in that treaty are binding at every level of government. It's not just the federal government. The states, local, and municipal governments are all bound by the obligations in the treaty, and they're also obligated under the treaty to publicize the terms of the treaty. I will bet that most of our listeners and most of the people in this country don't know what human rights treaties the United States has ratified, and even if they do, are not familiar with what the provisions are, that the legal obligations that we have taken on by ratifying those treaties. And that in and of itself is a violation of the treaty, because when we ratify a treaty, we agree to publicize the terms of the treaty.
On to the international crisis at this point. The U.S. is saying they are going to war with ISIS or ISIL. We've come to a point to where getting involved in this perpetual war, as you call it, there's no military solution. Obama has said this. The generals have said this. Dempsey was on TV the other day basically saying there is no military solution to this, yet we are going in. At the end of your article on this perpetual war that we are basically in, you talk a little bit about political solutions to the outcome, to degrade the power of ISIS, to address some of what is going on with the rise of this force within the region. Can you expand on some of those?
The reason that ISIS was born was in reaction to the United States and Bush totally destabilizing that country, installing this puppet Nouri al-Maliki, who for the last 2.5 years since the U.S. troops pulled out has been repressing Sunnis. He's a Shiite, repressing Sunnis, raping, torturing, murdering, arbitrarily detaining people. And so the Sunnis are more afraid of that government and the United States air power than they are of ISIS. ISIS is a horrible organization, but keep in mind that Obama is asking Congress to fund the Free Syrian Army, which itself beheaded 6 captives. So, and when we blow people up with drones and body parts are all over the place, we should be equally outraged about that. So there is no military solution to this conflict, and Obama said that, and unfortunately his actions don't comport with his words. The United States should go to the Security Council, and he is going, but nothing other than just sharing information and having states outlaw travel of foreign fighters to these areas in the Middle East. But what the Security Council should do is declare an immediate ceasefire, send a peacekeeping mission to the area, declare a total arms embargo from all countries, including the United States and the Arab countries, to the region, and come up with a regional diplomatic solution, including Syria and Iran, our arch enemies. But if we really want a solution here, it cannot be a military solution. It has to be a diplomatic solution. More military action, U.S. bombing. Eventually, U.S. troops will be. There are already 1,600 U.S. troops there, whether we want to talk about boots on the ground or not. That is only going to make the situation worse, the same way that we have made every situation worse when we've gone in with military force in that region.
It seems like Obama's kind of between just this sort of rock and hard place, because on the right, they're pushing him to be much more bellicose. On the left, there is a lot of reticence about going into this situation. And clearly, he is getting international pressure from certainly Britain, and after the beheading of the journalists, and even with Britain having one of their own beheaded. You even see Britain pulling back, essentially. At first they were saying, yes, we're coming after you for this. And it seems like we've got a lot of fear that is being ramped up within the United States. There's a lot of fear that ISIS is going to come through the U.S.-Mexico border and do all sorts of terrorist activities. You've got Dianne Feinstein saying, don't underestimate the threat of this group, because they are going to act differently than Al-Qaeda. They're going to act on a smaller scale. So you have, within the political culture of Washington, D.C., a tremendous amount of fear that is putting pressure on the president to act in a certain way.
Well, the president, in his speech last week, admitted that ISIS is not a threat to the United States at this point. There is no imminent threat. So what are we doing over there? I mean, it's a horrible thing that these journalists were beheaded. There's no doubt about it. But why did ISIS pick 2 Americans and a Brit? Because of our involvement there, because of the hatred against the U.S. government there. And although these were not governmental people, the ISIS, I believe, saw them as indicative of U.S. presence and British presence in that area where we have no business being.
We're going to leave it there. Marjorie, I want to thank you for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thank you, Ted. I appreciate it.
Well, you can read Marjorie's pieces on Truthout. The first one is called U.S. Slammed for Failure to Fulfill Legal Obligation to Eliminate All Forms of Race Discrimination. And the second one is Obama Declares Perpetual War. Both of these are featured on her new monthly column called Human Rights and Global Wrongs. And she's also got a book coming out, Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues. That comes out next month. Thanks again for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and we'll see you next time.